The Roman Empire had once imagined itself without an ending. Its legions marched as if the world were a boundary waiting to be revised, and each new province looked, from the Forum, like proof that history moved in one direction, outward. Yet, at the height of Roman confidence, one emperor studied the same map and chose a different kind of mastery. He chose to stop taking, he chose to hold. He traded fresh conquests for fixed frontiers, and he discovered that restraint, in an empire built on expansion, could be as perilous as ambition. He became known as the builder, emperor, and the traveler, the man who crossed more of Rome's world than any Caesar before him, binding it together by inspection, discipline, and spectacle. He also became, to his enemies, the ruler who built walls because he understood how quickly an empire could strain and fracture at its seams. The controlled image stone, law, ceremony never fully concealed the pressures beneath it: fear in the Senate, demands in the provinces, unrest at the edges, and a private loneliness that no palace architecture could soften. His reign moved through three worlds that never fully reconciled. There were the Greek cities whose culture captivated him and unsettled Roman tradition. There was the wet northern edge of Britannia, where stone was laid across peat and wind to declare an end to easy movement. And there was Judea, where empire met faith, memory, and a refusal to yield, and where Hadrian's ideas of order collided with an identity that would not be negotiated. What followed was more than a catalogue of monuments. It became an answer never final, never cling to a political question older than Rome itself, whether the strength of a state was measured by what it took, or by what it could hold. Hadrian governed in a world where law could be magnificent and uncompromising at once, where citizenship could be granted as a reward and revoked as punishment, and where the emperor's will could overrule any court. It was a system balanced on personal authority, tradition, and coercive capacity, and it produced dilemmas that felt familiar across ages: the cost of distant campaigns, the resentment of provinces, the burdens of taxation, the anxiety of borders, the struggle to define identity in a vast, unequal realm. The Romans remembered him with titles that sounded like praise and warning combined: restorer, builder, traveler. Behind them stood a man capable of sudden severity, and a ruler haunted by what his own policies set in motion. His name was Publius alias Hadrianus Hadrian, called by some, sometimes with admiration and sometimes with contempt, the most Greek of Romans, and by others the emperor who drew lines because he knew what followed when an empire refused to. He was born into an empire, still intoxicated by conquest. When Hadrian entered the world in 76 CE, Rome's political structure was imperial in fact, and republican in costume. The Senate met and debated and voted honors, but the emperor commanded the legions, appointed governors, and decided which laws mattered in practice. The Pax Romana existed, but it was never merely a calm. It was an arrangement maintained by garrisons, taxation, and the certainty that major defiance would meet a decisive response. Roman culture praised discipline and ancestral tradition, yet consumed Greek art, Greek philosophy, and Greek education with the appetite of conquerors who envied the conquered. The elite spoke Roman titles and Greek ideas in the same breath. A man could discuss virtue and still purchase human beings. A senator could praise liberty while listening, with dread, for a rumor from the palace. Beneath the marble rituals of public life, Rome's social order rested on hierarchy and compulsion. For most people, society was a ladder with missing rungs. At the bottom were enslaved laborers and the desperately poor. Above them, freedmen, artisans, and soldiers. Then the local elites of the provinces. And finally the senatorial and equestrian classes clustered around Rome's political heart. Many lived close to subsistence. In cities, rent and food pressed hard. In the countryside, harvest failure could mean hunger, debt, and loss of land. Stability was felt less as comfort than as the absence of catastrophe. Precise prices changed by region and year, and the evidence survived unevenly, but the daily arithmetic of life remained unforgiving. A common laborer in Italy might earn only a few sesterces, a dinar for basic staples, not enough to build a cushion against illness or bad luck. A simple loaf of bread in ordinary times might cost a couple of asses, a manageable fraction of a day's wages, yet shortages could turn bread into panic and politics into desperation. Milk more often goat or sheep than cows, local and perishable, less central than grain and wine. Where it was sold in towns, it might cost roughly an as or two for a modest measure, cheap enough when available, absent when not. For many, The most reliable guarantee of bread was not the market, but the state. In Rome itself, the grain dole tied survival to political stability, and stability to the credibility of whoever held power. This was the world Hadrian inherited to rule, a Mediterranean system knitted together by roads and sea lanes, made magnificent by engineering and extraction, threatened by distance, corruption, and the simple fact that messages and armies moved at the speed of horses and ships. It was also a world shaped by the ambitions of Trajan, his predecessor, whose eastern campaigns had reached for new lands and exposed how quickly conquest could turn into overextension. Hadrian's story began, as Roman stories often did, with adoption, patronage, and the quiet machinery of elite networks. He was born in Italica in Hispania Baetica, near modern Seville, into a family of Roman settlers with wealth, status, and ties to power. His lineage placed him within the imperial orbit, and his fate would be shaped by a single fact of blood and connection: his relationship to Trajan, the general who became emperor. Orphaned young, Hadrian came under the guardianship of Trajan and of Trajan's wife Platina, a figure remembered as formidable and influential. From the beginning he lived on the threshold between provincial origins and metropolitan power. He received the education of an aristocrat: Latin rhetoric, law, and the habits of command. But what marked him out early was his devotion to Greek culture. It won him a nickname that carried admiration and mockery at once: Grek, the little Greek. He read Greek literature with the hunger of someone seeking a second homeland of the mind. Compared with the average child of the empire, Hadrian's youth unfolded in another universe, where an ordinary boy might be pushed toward farm labor, apprenticed to a trade, or taught enough letters to keep accounts. Hadrian moved through tutors, correspondence, patronage, and advancement. Where many families calculated the week's grain, he learned to calculate influence. Where most could hope only to endure the next tax collector, he was trained to become the authority behind the collector's power. Privilege alone did not guarantee greatness. Rome produced countless noble youths who ended in obscurity. Hadrian's difference lay in restlessness, a fascination with distant provinces, a desire to see with his own eyes what others governed through reports, and an instinct rare among those raised at the center that the empire was not a trophy case but a living organism. Even early, he seemed to take the empire seriously as a system that could break. That restlessness found its arena where Roman ambition always demanded proof: the military and the political ladder. In Rome, to rise was to be seen rising, and the steps upward led through offices, legions, and dangerous intimacy with power. The empire that had given him education would demand demonstrations of worth, and it would penalize missteps with a cold efficiency. Hadrian's ascent followed the formal sequence of a Roman aristocratic career. But behind the offices pulsed the real engine: imperial favor. He served in military posts, absorbed the rhythms of discipline, and gained a reputation for competence. In the legions, reputation could be currency more durable than silver. He learned how to speak to soldiers in their own harsh language, and how to speak to senators with controlled elegance, never forgetting which audience could unmake an emperor, and which could merely complicate him. His opportunities widened as Trajan's star rose. Under Trajan, Rome pushed into Dacia, and then eastward against Parthia. Triumph followed triumph, and with each victory the empire grew, richer and more strained. Expansion poured treasure into Rome, but it demanded more troops, more administrators, more roads, more garrisons, more promises to allies and veterans. What looked like glory in the capital could feel like exhaustion at the edges. Hadrian moved close to the flame. He married into Trajan's circle and strengthened his ties, positioning himself for succession in a system that pretended not to be dynastic while functioning as one. Roman politics rarely depended on a single quality called merit. It depended on networks, marriages, alliances, and the careful placement of supporters in key offices. Hadrian's climb was not a simple tale of talent rewarded. It was the art of survival among jealous nobles and ambitious generals, where a misjudged friendship could become a ruinous liability. Then came the moment that turned proximity into power. Trajan died in 117 CE, far from Rome, with the eastern frontier unsettled. Succession, always dangerous in an empire that feared internal conflict, arrived amid military uncertainty. Hadrian emerged as the new emperor, reportedly adopted by Trajan at the end. Even in antiquity, the timing and documentation were debated. Some sources suggested Platina's influence proved decisive, that letters and seals carried the final decision. What remained beyond dispute was the outcome. Hadrian took power, and the empire exhaled in relief that the legions did not split into competing claimants. With the purple came control of immense resources and the burden of imperial finances. The emperor did not need to accumulate wealth like a private man. He inherited the machinery that directed revenues from provinces, taxes, mines, and estates. The measure of his ambition would be revealed, not in what he possessed, but in where he aimed the empire's money and attention: toward campaigns, toward cities, toward walls, toward land, toward the fragile legitimacy that every emperor had to rebuild each day. If his rise depended on quiet instruments, his first great act was a public reversal. He abandoned some of Trajan's eastern acquisitions, judging them indefensible. In any era, withdrawal invited accusations of weakness. In Rome, it also sounded like heresy against the empire's self. Hadrian chose consolidation, and in choosing it, he created enemies among men who had profited from perpetual expansion and among elites who mistook growth for destiny. The enemies did not remain abstract. The empire had accepted a new emperor, but it had not yet decided whether it trusted him. Hadrian understood that to rule Rome was to prove, repeatedly, that he deserved it. He would build not only with stone, but with policy, law, inspection, and, when necessary, intimidation. And the more he insisted on order, the more he invited the suspicion that his order served himself first. Hadrian's defining achievements did not come as a single victory. They came as an imperial philosophy, given physical form. He became the traveling emperor. Where others stayed in Rome and governed through letters, he moved through the provinces like a living audit, arriving with a court, engineers, surveyors, soldiers, and scribes. His presence carried reassurance and warning at once. Governors learned that reports could no longer hide neglect. Cities learned that petitions might reach the emperor without passing through a dozen intermediaries. Loyalty became something performed in person, under the weight of an imperial gaze. He reformed administration and justice, leaning on trained jurists and tightening procedure. Roman law was already sophisticated, yet it remained entangled with status. Punishments and privileges differed sharply between elite and poor. Hadrian's reign did not erase inequality, but it sought predictability, a system that functioned through rules rather than improvisation. In a world where a governor's whim could ruin a province, procedure could feel like restraint. It was also control, because consistent rules made the empire more governable and made defiance easier to classify and prosecute. He built on a scale that reshaped landscapes. In Rome, he rebuilt the Pantheon, giving it the dome that still seemed to hang like a captured planet over the city's heart. It was not simply architecture, it was propaganda in stone. Rome as the center of the world, the gods contained beneath a single ordered sphere, light pouring through the oculus like approval from above. On the empire's edge, he built the monument that hardened into legend, Hadrian's Wall in Britannia. It ran across the island, a line of stone and turf punctuated by forts and It was not an impenetrable barrier, it was a managed boundary, a way to regulate movement, trade, and raiding, to mark where Rome ended and where uncertainty began. It brought psychological clarity to a frontier, and it announced to soldiers and provincials alike that the age of casual expansion had given way to a new doctrine. Borders would be administered, yet success created new risks. Walls could offend those left outside and embitter those compelled to supply labor and materials. Bureaucracy could harden into oppression. A ruler who demanded order could come to see dissent, not as politics, but as an existential threat. Hadrian's administrative brilliance carried within it the seed of intolerance, the desire for uniformity across a world that could not be made uniform without coercion. As his building projects rose, so did murmurs in Rome. Senators watched an emperor who admired Greek culture, traveled rather than presiding over their ceremonies, relied on advisors and equestrians, and treated the old aristocracy as one instrument among many. The tension was not always expressed as open resistance. In Rome, resentment often wore the mask of etiquette, but it accumulated, and it waited for moments of weakness. Power in Rome never sat unchallenged, and Hadrian's early years were shadowed by a blunt political reckoning. Several prominent senators of consular rank were condemned and put to death soon after his accession, accused of conspiracy. Ancient sources differed on Hadrian's direct responsibility. Some suggested he authorized the sentences, Others implied subordinates acted to secure the new regime, perhaps without explicit instruction. The effect mattered regardless. In the Senate, fear acted like a solvent. It dissolved loyalty into compliance and left behind something brittle that could crack when pressure returned. Hadrian tried to balance severity with a cultivated image of fairness. He presented himself as a princeps who listened, who judged, who lived with discipline rather than indulgence. But opposition did not always rise as organized conspiracy. It often rose as wounded pride. Elite Romans resented a ruler who seemed to stand above them and beyond them, more at home in Greek theatres and provincial councils than in the traditional choreography of senatorial life. Beyond Rome, conflict was more literal. Hadrian inspected armies, demanded rigorous training, and enforced standards that had dulled in peacetime. For soldiers, this could mean restored purpose and sharper identity. It could also mean fatigue, harsh discipline, and the sense of being watched by an emperor who valued readiness over comfort. The frontier was not merely a line on a map, it was a culture of constant preparation, and Hadrian insisted that preparation be practiced daily. For the common people of the provinces, pressure often arrived first as economics rather than battle. Fortifying borders and maintaining a traveling court demanded money. Taxes pressed, requisitions burdened local communities. When security operations intensified, forced labor, seizures of goods, and displacement could follow. Rome's peace, so praised in inscriptions, was financed and enforced across a vast population. Even competent governance carried a price paid in grain, coin, and compliance. No crisis revealed the limits of Hadrian's vision more starkly than Judea. Their identity was not merely local custom, but covenant, law, and memory. Hadrian's policies, his plans for a Roman colony in Jerusalem called Italica Apellina, and the broader pressure of Romanization collided with a population already scarred by earlier revolts and reprisals. When the Bar Kokhba revolt erupted around 132 CE, it was not a brief disturbance. It became a sustained uprising, organized and charged with existential meaning, a challenge not only to Roman administration, but to Roman legitimacy. Hadrian answered with the full weight of empire. Legions were concentrated, generals dispatched, and strategy shifted toward sieges and long-duration containment. Strongholds were taken, supply routes disrupted, and resistance was worn down through deprivation and overwhelming pressure. The region endured a catastrophic human and material toll, including mass displacement, widespread enslavement, and punitive measures against communities and settlements. Ancient casualty totals were enormous and may have been inflated, but the scale of devastation was not in doubt. After the revolt, the province was reorganized, and Jewish ties to Jerusalem were further restricted. Rome prevailed, but the outcome carried a cost measured not only in resources and legitimacy, but in a memory that would outlast the administrative settlement. Even Hadrian's private life, where emperors sometimes found refuge, became politically resonant. His relationship with Antinous, a young man from Bithynia, drew attention because the emperor's affections were never merely personal. When Antinous died in Egypt in 130 CE, by drowning in the Nile under circumstances that remained unknown, Hadrian's grief transformed into cult. Antinous was deified, his image spread across the empire in statues that blended Greek beauty with Roman power. Some contemporaries were scandalized, others complied. Many simply watched as sorrow became policy. In Rome, even grief could be imperial, and even love could become a language of authority. By the middle of his reign, the empire Hadrian sought to stabilize also seemed to trap him. Enemies did not always appear with weapons drawn. They appeared as courtiers shaping information, senators concealing resentment behind ritual, provincial elites flattering the emperor while guarding their own interests, and insurgents who dissolved into the landscape and returned when conditions favored them. His rule demanded vigilance. Vigilance, sustained too long, hardened into suspicion, and suspicion narrowed the space in which a ruler could trust anyone, even himself. Eventually strain found its way into Hadrian's body. The emperor who had walked frontiers and moved through provinces began to fail. Illness slowed the traveling emperor, and the builder, who had tried to impose order on distance, faced a problem that could not be solved by inspection or stone: succession, the empire's most dangerous inheritance. Hadrian's later years were marked by pain and the tightening of a world that had once seemed limitless. The sources spoke of edema and declining health, of a body betraying a mind that still burned with plans. Movement had been his instrument of control. Now confinement made him dependent on the same court politics he had tried to master by presence. Power became something heard through doors and carried by intermediaries, always vulnerable to distortion. Succession haunted him because Rome had suffered too many internal struggles to treat inheritance as a private matter. Hadrian adopted Lucius Aelius Caesar as heir, then watched him die before Hadrian himself. The loss forced another decision, and Hadrian chose Antoninus Pius, a man known for administrative steadiness, on the condition that Antoninus adopt two younger heirs in turn, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. It was an attempt to engineer stability beyond his lifetime, to bind the future in legal commitments, strong enough to hold an empire together. Yet the final years also revived the darker shadows of Hadrian's rule. Some accounts described renewed prosecutions and harsh penalties, perhaps driven by fear that rivals waited for the moment of weakness. Whether every story was accurate, or whether hostile writers sharpened them after the fact, they reflected the atmosphere that often gathered around a declining autocrat, a court thick with calculation, a city measuring time by rumors, a senate remembering earlier purges and preparing for the next reign. If betrayal existed in his final act, it was less a single dramatic blow than a system that made loyalty conditional and legitimacy forever incomplete. In such a regime, motives were rarely pure. Men served the emperor, but they also served survival. The shifting of alliances was not an exception. It was the mechanism by which Rome's political class insulated itself from the unpredictability of imperial favor. Hadrian died in 138 CE at Baetica, near the Bay of Naples, amid villas and sea air that could not soften the approach of death. The man who had tried to define Rome's limits reached the one boundary he could not fortify. Tradition credited him with a short poem addressed to his own soul, tender and bleak, as if the private truth behind public magnificence finally surfaced in a few restrained lines. His reign had produced stability through consolidation, magnificence through building, and lasting trauma through suppression. Without Hadrian, Rome might have pursued expansion longer and perhaps suffered earlier from overextension or military fragmentation. With Hadrian, the empire endured into a period later remembered as calmer, but some provinces paid dearly for that endurance. When the empire moved forward under Antoninus Pius, it did so along channels Hadrian had carved, channels lined with stone and law, and in places, the residue of ruin. What remained after him was more than monuments. It was an imperial posture, ruled by presence, by inspection, by visible investment, and by controlled borders. That posture shaped the 2nd century, for better and for worse, and it offered later generations a model of what an empire did when it decided it had reached the edge of sustainable expansion. Hadrian's legacy stayed, contested partly because it was so visible. Builders were easier to praise than conquerors, and he left behind tangible proof: the Pantheon's dome, the remains of his villa at Tivoli, the hard line of Hadrian's wall, the cities he adorned, the temples and arches that turned provincial landscapes into Roman landscapes. In architecture, he made the empire feel eternal, and eternity was what Rome always sold itself. Administratively, he strengthened the imperial center without always humiliating local pride. His travels signaled that provinces mattered, that Rome was not merely a city but a system spanning continents. For historians of governance, he represented the empire learning to manage itself, transforming conquest into maintenance and improvisation into procedure. Yet there remained the other Hadrian, the emperor whose accession was followed by senatorial deaths, the ruler who imposed overwhelming measures in Judea, the man whose desire for order could become a demand for submission. Ancient writers divided over him. Some admired his energy and intelligence, others distrusted his motives and remembered his severity. Modern historians continued to weigh hostile sources against the evidence of effective rule, debating whether he was a conscientious administrator trapped in a brutal system or a refined autocrat who used culture as a shield. The answer held both elements because Rome itself held both. Civilization and coercion fused together, inseparable in practice. He mattered because the central questions of his reign never settled into the past. When a powerful state reached the edge of expansion, it faced choices that sounded simple and proved painful. Whether to spend itself on endless frontiers or to draw lines and defend them. Whether to rely on the force of a single will or to build institutions that could outlast one life. Hadrian tried to do both. and the tension between those goals ran through his reign like a crack through polished marbles, sometimes hidden by light, sometimes exposed by pressure. In the end, his image was captured less in triumph than in stillness. The emperor, older, far from the wet wall and the bright Greek cities, listening to the sounds of a court that already belonged to someone else. The great traveler at last confined, the builder surrounded by finished stone, the ruler who had sought to order the world confronting the one disorder no edict restrained. Rome called its rulers gods, yet each emperor learned, in his own way, the same lesson. Power could draw borders on maps, but it could not abolish the borders of flesh. Hadrian had tried to teach the empire restraint, to convince it that permanence was constructed rather than seized. His walls did not last forever. His laws were revised. His statues fell and rose again under new eyes. What remained was the question he wrestled with, and never resolved for good: how to hold what had been taken, and what an empire was willing to become when it could no longer pretend that expansion was its destiny. So Hadrian endured, not merely in ruins and inscriptions, but as a warning carved into history, that the mightiest empires were not undone only by rivals beyond their frontiers, but by the moment they could no longer decide where they ended on the map, in their laws, and in their own understanding of themselves.